The same ex-boyfriend who just cornered me by the bar, loudly telling everyone I'm a fake soldier playing dress-up, is about to watch 800 people rise to their feet in my honor when they announce I'm the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in modern military history. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and if stories about proving your worth resonate with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more incredible saved for you. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel is buzzing with Chicago's most influential elite. Politicians with familiar faces from the evening news, business leaders whose companies shape the skyline, philanthropists whose names grace hospital wings, and military supporters whose donations fund everything from veteran housing to advanced prosthetics research. Crystal chandeliers imported from Austria cast warm golden light over women draped in designer gowns that cost more than most people's cars, while men navigate the crowd in perfectly tailored tuxedos, their conversations a careful dance of networking and social positioning. And then there's me, standing near the silent auction tables displaying everything from weekend getaways to private art collections, wearing my dress blue uniform like a beacon in a sea of black tie elegance. I'm 25-year-old Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army, and I came here tonight with one simple, straightforward goal: represent my unit at this fundraiser, smile politely through the cocktail hour, and quietly slip out before the formal program begins and the real networking starts. What I absolutely did not expect was to run into Derek Morrison, my ex-boyfriend from 3 years ago, who apparently decided this crowded ballroom filled with Chicago's power brokers was the perfect venue to settle some old scores and showcase his particular brand of public humiliation. He's positioned himself strategically near the premium bar, already 3 martinis deep, judging by the flush across his cheekbones, and the way his gestures have become increasingly animated. His voice carries over the gentle hum of polite conversation as he holds court with a small group of his investment banking colleagues, men in their 30s who treat networking events like hunting expeditions, and view every interaction through the lens of potential deals or social climbing opportunities. Quote, I mean, look at her, Derek is saying, gesturing in my direction with his martini glass, the olive speared on a tiny sword catching the light. Still playing dress-up in that military costume. You'd think after all these years she'd have figured out that the whole soldier thing is just an extended phase. Like when kids want to be firefighters or astronauts, except she never grew out of it. His companions laugh. The kind of polite, uncomfortable laughter that wealthy men use when they're not quite sure if joining in makes them complicit in something unsavory, but they're too invested in the social dynamic to extract themselves gracefully. Elena always had this hero complex, Derek continues, warming to his theme and apparently forgetting that sound carries in marble-floored ballrooms with vaulted ceilings. Thought she was going to save the world or something. I kept telling her she had real potential. She could have been in public relations, or event planning, or any number of respectable careers where her organizational skills could have been put to good use. But no, she had to go play soldier. I can feel the attention of nearby guests beginning to drift toward our little drama. A woman in emerald silk raises her eyebrows as she pretends to study the auction catalog. A retired general I recognize from newspaper photos pauses mid-conversation with a city councilman, his expression hardening as he processes Derek's words. Even the catering staff seem to be moving more slowly, their professional invisibility compromised by curiosity about the unfolding social train wreck. The worst part, Derek continues, oblivious to his growing audience, is that she actually thinks she's some kind of hero, like, Elena, you're a desk jockey in the army. You push papers around and attend meetings. Let's not pretend you're storming beaches or anything. What Derek doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend as he stands there in his $3,000 Armani suit, trying to impress his Wall Street friends with his casual dismissal of my military service, is that in exactly 90 seconds, I'm going to be called to that stage not as some random military attendee or token service member, but as the evening's guest of honor. The same woman he's currently dismissing as a desk jockey who plays soldier is about to be recognized for actions so extraordinary, so far beyond the comprehension of anyone in this ballroom, that they earned me the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration this country can bestow, reserved for acts of valor that go so far above and beyond the call of duty that they redefine what courage looks like. I'm not just the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in modern military history. I'm one of only 8 women to ever receive this recognition, and the first to earn it for actions in the global war on terror. The citation, which will be read aloud in exactly 83 seconds, describes actions that took place over 4 days in Afghanistan that saved 127 lives and prevented what intelligence analysts later determined would have been the deadest attack on American forces since the Battle of Kamdesh. But Derek doesn't know any of this. Derek doesn't know that while he was building his portfolio and networking his way up the investment banking hierarchy, I was leading rescue operations behind enemy lines. Derek doesn't know that while he was worried about quarterly earnings reports and client presentations, I was coordinating airstrikes and medical evacuations while taking fire from 3 directions. Derek doesn't know that the desk jockey he's mocking spent 6 months in the mountains of Afghanistan, embedded with special operations forces, coordinating intelligence gathering and strategic operations that disrupted terrorist networks across 4 countries. Derek doesn't know that the woman he's dismissing as someone who pushes papers around carried 2 wounded soldiers 3 miles through hostile territory, fighting off attackers while calling in her own air support. Derek doesn't know any of this because Derek never bothered to ask. During our entire 2-year relationship, he treated my military service like an inconvenient hobby that interfered with his vision of our social trajectory. When I received deployment orders, he saw it as a career mistake. When I talked about my training, he changed the subject to restaurant reservations or weekend plans. When I tried to explain why my work mattered, he redirected the conversation to his latest promotion or bonus announcement. The irony is so perfect, so cinematically precise, that it feels like divine intervention orchestrated by a cosmic screenwriter with an appreciation for poetic justice. The man who spent months trying to convince me to leave the military because it was unladylike and held me back from my real potential is about to discover that my potential exceeded anything his limited imagination could conjure. Derek, who once told me that real women don't need to prove themselves by playing with guns, is about to learn that this particular woman proved herself by saving more lives in 4 days than he'll positively impact in his entire investment banking career. Derek, who suggested I was compensating for something by choosing military service over the more traditional path he'd mapped out for us, is about to watch 800 of Chicago's most influential citizens rise to their feet in recognition of compensations that redefined American military doctrine. Derek, who broke up with me 3 years ago because he was embarrassed to introduce a soldier to his clients and colleagues, is about to be publicly associated with someone whose achievements will be studied in military academies for decades. But before we get to that delicious moment of cosmic justice, let me tell you exactly how we arrived at this point, because the story of Derek Morrison's about to unfold public humiliation begins with the story of how he never understood who I really was, and how tonight, everyone in this room is about to learn truths he was too self-absorbed to discover. The Grand Meridian Hotel represents everything Derek values: prestige, exclusivity, the kind of old money elegance that whispers rather than shouts its importance. The ballroom where we're standing has hosted presidents and foreign dignitaries, corporate titans, and cultural luminaries. The guest list reads like a who's who of American influence: senators, CEOs, federal judges, university presidents, and military leaders whose decisions shape global policy. This is Derek's natural habitat, the environment where he feels most comfortable and confident. Investment banking taught him to read rooms like this, to identify the power players and social hierarchies, to position himself strategically within networks that can advance his career and social status. He's wearing his success-like armor, the perfectly tailored tuxedo, the Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most people's annual salary, the easy confidence that comes from a 7-figure income and a Gold Coast penthouse. And in this environment, surrounded by the markers of conventional success, Derek sees my uniform as an anachronism, a reminder of a world that operates by different rules and values, different achievements. To him, I represent a path not taken, a phase he's glad I moved past, a reminder of the time in his life when he dated someone who prioritized service over status. What he doesn't understand, what he's never understood, is that my uniform represents achievements that dwarf anything anyone in this room has accomplished. The ribbons on my chest aren't decorations. They're a condensed biography of actions taken in the most dangerous places on earth, decisions made under pressure that would break most people, responsibilities shouldered that most people can't even imagine. The bronze star with V device represents actions in Iraq where I led a convoy through an ambush, keeping supply lines open to forward operating bases while under sustained enemy fire. The purple heart represents injuries sustained during a mortar attack on our compound in Afghanistan, where I continued coordinating defensive operations despite shrapnel wounds that required 3 surgeries to fully repair. The combat action badge represents direct engagement with enemy forces during operations that remain classified but fundamentally altered the strategic balance in our area of operations. The Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters represents a pattern of exceptional performance that caught the attention of senior leadership and led to increasingly challenging assignments. And above all these, positioned with mathematical precision according to military regulation, is the ribbon that makes other military personnel stop and stare, the Medal of Honor. The light blue ribbon with white stars that represents the single highest form of recognition this country can bestow on someone who wore its uniform. Derek sees these ribbons as costume jewelry, military bling, designed to make an ordinary soldier feel important. He has no conception that each one represents actions that saved lives, operations that succeeded, missions that mattered on a scale he's never considered. He's about to learn differently. The event coordinator is making her way toward the podium now, checking her notes and adjusting the microphone height. She's a consummate professional who's managed events like this for 15 years, and she knows exactly how to build anticipation for moments like what's about to happen. In 60 seconds, she's going to begin the formal program with the standard acknowledgments, thanking sponsors, recognizing VIP attendees, setting the stage for the evening's purpose. In 75 seconds, she's going to transition to the main event, the reason all these influential people gathered on a Tuesday night in October. In 90 seconds, she's going to read the citation that accompanies the Medal of Honor, describing actions that took place in Afghanistan over 4 days in March that saved 127 American lives and prevented what would have been the deadliest attack on U.S. forces since 2009. And in 100 seconds, every person in this ballroom is going to understand exactly who Captain Elena Vasquez really is. Derek is still holding court near the bar, his voice growing louder as the alcohol lowers his inhibitions and amplifies his need to demonstrate his sophisticated worldview to his investment banking colleagues. He's moved on from dismissing my military service to analyzing what he sees as my character flaws, apparently feeling that his financial success gives him insights into human psychology that justify this public character assassination. The problem with Elena, he's explaining to his increasingly uncomfortable audience, is that she never learned to be realistic about her limitations. Military service attracts people who need external validation, who can't find meaning in normal civilian achievements. It's like a security blanket for people who can't compete in the real world. One of his colleagues, a man I don't recognize but whose discomfort is visible from across the room, tries to change the subject by asking about a recent market development. Derek waves off the attempt with the casual dismissiveness of someone who's sure he has a captive audience. No, this is important, Derek insists. Understanding personality types is crucial in our business. Elena represents a whole category of people who choose military service because they can't handle the complexity and ambiguity of civilian careers. They need rigid structure, clear hierarchies, simple moral frameworks. They can't function in environments where success requires creativity and strategic thinking. Quote, "The irony of Derek Morrison, a man whose greatest achievement is moving other people's money around, lecturing a room about strategic thinking while standing 20 feet from someone who developed military strategy that's currently being taught at the War College, would be hilarious if it weren't so perfectly emblematic of his complete disconnection from reality." But Derek isn't finished. He's building to what he clearly considers his closing argument, the insight that will demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of human nature and cement his position as the most perceptive person in his little circle. The really sad part, he continues, lowering his voice just enough to suggest he's sharing insider knowledge, is that Elena actually had potential. She was smart, organized, good with people. She could have been successful in public relations or marketing or event management. But she chose to waste that potential playing soldier because she needed to feel special. It's actually kind of tragic when you think about it. Could have been successful in public relations. Could have been successful in marketing. Could have been successful in event management. Derek Morrison, investment banker and part-time social critic, has just explained to a room full of Chicago's elite that the woman who led the most successful counterterrorism operation in modern Afghan history could have been successful planning corporate retreats. The event coordinator taps the microphone twice, creating that distinctive feedback sound that cuts through cocktail party conversation like a blade. The ballroom begins to quiet, conversations trailing off as 800 of Chicago's most influential citizens turn their attention toward the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, she begins, her voice carrying the authority of someone who's managed events for presidents and foreign ministers. If I could have your attention, please. We're ready to begin this evening's formal program. Derek is still talking, apparently unaware that the entire room is shifting focus. His voice, no longer competing with general conversation, carries further than he intends. The whole military thing is really just an extended adolescence, he's saying. She'll figure it out eventually and find a real career, but by then she'll have wasted the best years of her life pretending to be something she's not. Quote. The event coordinator continues with practiced professionalism, but I can see her eyes flick toward Derek's group with the barely perceptible irritation of someone who's dealt with inconsiderate guests throughout her career. Before we begin tonight's program, I want to acknowledge some very special guests who honor us with their presence. We're joined this evening by Senator Patricia Williams, Chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. Polite applause fills the ballroom as Senator Williams raises her hand in acknowledgement. Derek finally seems to realize that a formal program has begun, but rather than moderating his voice, he leans closer to his companions and continues his analysis in what he probably thinks is a whisper. What I'm saying is that Elena never learned to separate fantasy from reality. Military service lets people live in a world where they can pretend their actions matter on some grand scale, when really they're just following orders and hoping for the best. We're also honored to be joined by General Robert Chen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Maria Santos, current commanding general of the Third Army. More applause, more acknowledgements. The general I'd noticed earlier is now staring directly at Derek with an expression that could freeze champagne. Other military attendees, and there are more than Derek apparently realized, are turning to locate the source of the commentary that's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But Derek, emboldened by alcohol and the attention of his colleagues, seems to interpret the growing focus as validation of his insights rather than the social catastrophe it actually represents. The truth is, he says, his voice now clearly audible to anyone within 30 feet. Elena chose military service because she couldn't handle the competition of the real world. It's easier to be a big fish in a small pond than to test yourself against the best and brightest in civilian careers. Couldn't handle the competition of the real world. Derek Morrison, who got his current position through his father's fraternity connections, and whose biggest professional challenge involves deciding which stocks to recommend to clients who already have more money than they can spend, has just announced that I couldn't handle real-world competition. The event coordinator has moved through the standard acknowledgments and is building toward the main event. Her voice takes on the more serious tone reserved for moments of genuine significance. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight not just to support our veterans, but to witness something truly extraordinary. In the history of the United States military, only 3,530 individuals have received the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, reserved for acts of valor that go so far above and beyond the call of duty that they inspire awe in those who hear their stories. The ballroom has fallen completely silent now, except for Derek, who seems oblivious to the shift in atmosphere and is apparently building toward his grand finale. What Elena never understood, he continues, his voice now the only sound competing with the event coordinator, is that real success requires sacrifice and risk-taking in environments where failure has actual consequences. Military service is just elaborate role-playing with government funding. Real success requires sacrifice and risk-taking in environments where failure has actual consequences. I think about the morning of March 15th in Afghanistan, when failure would have meant 127 American soldiers dying in their sleep. I think about the calculation I made in real time, weighing the probability of my own survival against the certainty of mass casualties if I didn't act. I think about the radio call I made to my commanding officer, calmly explaining that I was going to attempt something that violated every safety protocol we'd been taught, because following protocol would guarantee catastrophic loss of life. I think about sacrifice and risk-taking and consequences, and I wonder if Derek Morrison has ever made a decision where other people's lives hung in the balance. The event coordinator's voice rises with the gravity of what she's about to announce. Of those 3,530 Medal of Honor recipients throughout our nation's history, only 8 have been women. Only 8 women have demonstrated valor so extraordinary that it merited our highest military recognition. Derek is still talking, apparently determined to complete his psychological analysis regardless of the formal program happening around him. The whole hero complex is really just compensation for feeling ordinary, he explains to his increasingly mortified audience. Elena needed to feel special, needed to believe her life had some grand purpose, so she created this elaborate fantasy where she's saving the world, instead of just following orders like every other soldier. Tonight, the event coordinator continues, we have the extraordinary honor of recognizing the youngest of those 8 women, and the first to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in the global war on terror. The ballroom is completely silent now, except for Derek's voice, which seems to be operating on some kind of delayed awareness system that hasn't quite processed the magnitude of what's happening around him. I mean, look at her, he says, gesturing toward me with his martini glass. Elena's 25 years old. What could she possibly have accomplished that qualifies as heroic? It's all just elaborate make-believe designed to make ordinary people feel important. What could I possibly have accomplished that qualifies as heroic? The event coordinator takes a breath, consulting her notes one final time before reading the citation that will answer Derek's question in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Captain Elena Vasquez, recipient of the Medal of Honor for extraordinary acts of heroism during Operation Mountain Resolve in Afghanistan. And with those words, Derek Morrison's world is about to change forever. The silence that follows the announcement of my name is profound. The kind of absolute quiet that only happens when 800 people simultaneously stop breathing. It's the silence of collective realization, of minds processing information that doesn't align with their expectations, of a room full of influential people suddenly understanding they've been witnessing something extraordinary. Derek's martini glass freezes halfway to his lips, the olive speared on its tiny sword catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. His face undergoes a transformation that would be comical if it weren't so devastating to his carefully constructed self-image. Confusion giving way to dawning comprehension, comprehension giving way to horror, horror giving way to the kind of pale, sick realization that comes when you understand you've just publicly humiliated yourself in front of everyone who matters in your professional and social world. Medal of Honor? One of his investment banking colleagues whispers, his voice barely audible but carrying in the crystal-clear silence. Did she just say Medal of Honor? Derek's mouth opens and closes wordlessly, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. The confident swagger that carried him through his public character assassination just moments ago has evaporated, replaced by the stunned paralysis of someone watching their entire social world collapse in real time. The event coordinator continues reading from her prepared remarks, her professional voice carrying clearly throughout the ballroom as she begins to detail the citation that accompanies my Medal of Honor. Each word lands like a physical blow to Derek's credibility, systematically destroying every assumption he'd just shared with anyone within hearing distance. The President of the United States, in the name of Congress, takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 75th Ranger Regiment during combat operations against enemy forces in Afghanistan. 75th Ranger Regiment. The words hit the ballroom like thunder, and I can see the recognition dawning on the faces of the military personnel scattered throughout the crowd. The Rangers aren't desk jockeys or paper pushers. The Rangers are elite special operations forces, the people who get called when conventional military solutions aren't enough. The Rangers are the ones who volunteer for the missions that other soldiers consider suicide runs. Derek's face has progressed from confusion to a sickly gray pallor that makes him look like he's about to vomit on his perfectly polished Italian leather shoes. One of his colleagues, a man I recognize as a senior partner at his investment firm, takes a deliberate step away from Derek, creating physical distance from what's clearly about to become a social catastrophe of epic proportions. On March 15, 2023, Captain Vasquez was serving as a tactical intelligence coordinator embedded with Ranger units conducting counterterrorism operations in the Kunar province of Afghanistan. The event coordinator continues, her voice building the kind of dramatic tension that comes from reading accounts of genuine heroism to people who spend their lives in air-conditioned offices. March 15, 2023. The date that changed everything. The date that separated my life into before and after. The date that took an ordinary intelligence officer and transformed her into someone whose actions would be studied in military academies for decades to come. I can feel the memories rising, despite my efforts to keep them buried. The smell of diesel fuel and dust, the weight of my gear, the crackling voice over the radio that turned a routine morning into 4 days of sustained combat that would redefine what courage looks like. Derek is staring at me now, his earlier confidence completely shattered, his public persona crumbling like wet cardboard. The man who spent the last 20 minutes explaining to anyone who would listen that I was a desk jockey playing soldier is beginning to understand that he's been publicly demolishing someone whose achievements dwarf anything anyone in this ballroom has ever accomplished. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were planning a coordinated attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman, where 127 American soldiers were sleeping in what they believed was a secure location, the coordinator continues, each word systematically destroying Derek's credibility and replacing it with the kind of public humiliation that follows people for the rest of their careers. 127 American soldiers. The number hits the room like a physical force, and I can see the civilian attendees doing the math, understanding the scale of what was at stake, beginning to comprehend that they're in the presence of someone who prevented what would have been one of the deadliest attacks on American forces since the beginning of the global war on terror. Derek's investment banking colleagues are no longer standing near him. They've created a semicircle of empty space around him, the kind of social quarantine that happens when someone commits such a spectacular breach of judgment that association becomes professionally dangerous. These are men who've built their careers on reading situations and positioning themselves advantageously, and they can see with crystalline clarity that Derek Morrison has just revealed himself to be someone whose judgment cannot be trusted. Despite knowing that the planned route to the forward operating base was heavily defended, and that attempting to warn the sleeping soldiers would require traveling through 12 miles of hostile territory while under sustained enemy fire, Captain Vasquez volunteered to lead the warning mission. Volunteered. The word hangs in the air like an accusation, highlighting the gap between people who volunteer for missions that might kill them and people who volunteer for charity golf tournaments that might improve their networking opportunities. The contrast between Derek's definition of risk-taking, choosing which stocks to recommend to already wealthy clients, and actual risk-taking, volunteering to cross hostile territory under enemy fire, is so stark it borders on the absurd. I can see Derek's mind working, trying to process the information he's hearing and reconcile it with the version of me he'd created in his imagination. The Elena Vasquez he thought he knew was someone who needed external validation, someone who couldn't compete in the real world, someone who chose military service as an elaborate form of make-believe. The Elena Vasquez being described by the event coordinator is someone who voluntarily put herself in mortal danger to save 127 lives. The cognitive dissonance is visible on his face, the painful process of having your entire worldview challenged by undeniable evidence that you've been fundamentally wrong about something important. It's the expression of someone who's just discovered that their confident pronouncements about reality were based on assumptions so flawed they bordered on delusional. Leading a team of 6 Rangers, Captain Vasquez began the approach to Forward Operating Base Chapman at 0347 hours, knowing that enemy forces had established defensive positions along the entire route and that air support would be unavailable due to weather conditions that grounded all aircraft in the region. No air support? The detail lands with particular impact on the military personnel in the audience, who understand exactly what that means. In modern warfare, American forces operate with the expectation that aircraft can provide cover, evacuation, and fire support when ground operations go wrong. Operating without air support means operating without a safety net, accepting that if things go badly, you're on your own until you either complete the mission or die trying. Derek's face has progressed beyond pale to a greenish hue that suggests his body is rebelling against the psychological trauma of watching his public character assassination transform into his public humiliation. The man who confidently explained that military service attracts people who can't handle real-world competition is learning that real-world competition sometimes involves making life-or-death decisions while people are shooting at you. One of the women in emerald silk who'd been pretending to study the auction catalog earlier has abandoned all pretense and is staring openly at Derek, her expression a mixture of fascination and revulsion. She's witnessing a social catastrophe in real time, watching someone reveal themselves to be so profoundly wrong about something so important that it calls into question everything else they've ever said or believed. At 0412 hours, Captain Vasquez's team encountered the first of 3 heavily fortified enemy positions. Rather than retreat or call for the air support that was unavailable, Captain Vasquez made the decision to continue the mission, knowing that any delay would result in the death of 127 sleeping soldiers. The decision to continue. Another phrase that highlights the gap between the kind of decisions Derek makes in his climate-controlled office and the kind of decisions that actually matter. Derek's biggest professional challenge involves weighing risk and reward in financial markets where the worst-case scenario is losing money that was never his to begin with. My biggest professional challenge involved weighing the probability of my own death against the certainty of mass casualties if I failed to act. The ballroom has become a theater for Derek's destruction. 800 witnesses to his spectacular failure of judgment and character. These are people who will remember this moment, who will associate Derek Morrison's name with the kind of profound wrongness that makes you question someone's basic competence. In a city like Chicago, where professional reputation is everything, and social connections determine career trajectories, Derek has just committed professional suicide in front of everyone who matters. During the approach to the second enemy position, Captain Vasquez's team came under sustained fire from multiple directions. 2 Rangers were wounded, and the team's communications equipment was destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded within 3 feet of Captain Vasquez's position. I remember that explosion, the way it felt like being hit by a truck while someone was screaming in your ears. I remember the ringing that lasted for hours afterward, the taste of blood and dust. The moment of checking my body for wounds and being surprised to find myself still intact. I remember looking at Thompson and Rodriguez, both bleeding but conscious, and making the calculation that we could either evacuate the wounded and let 127 soldiers die, or continue the mission and hope everyone survived. Derek is no longer looking at me. He's staring at the floor, his entire body language suggesting someone who wishes he could disappear into the marble beneath his feet. The confident posture that carried him through his public analysis has collapsed into something approaching a crouch, as if he's trying to make himself physically smaller in response to the magnitude of his social catastrophe. Despite being wounded herself by shrapnel from the explosion, and despite losing all communication with headquarters, Captain Vasquez made the decision to continue toward Forward Operating Base Chapman, carrying 1 wounded Ranger while the other was supported by remaining team members. Wounded herself, the detail that Derek missed, the information that wasn't included in his confident assessment of my character and motivations. While he was building his analysis of my psychological need for external validation, I was bleeding from wounds sustained while trying to save lives he couldn't have imagined were at stake. The general I'd noticed earlier is now staring at Derek with an expression that could melt steel. This is a man who spent 40 years in military service, who's commanded troops in combat, who understands exactly what the citation is describing. He's watching a civilian who's never faced anything more dangerous than rush hour traffic publicly dismiss actions that represent the highest form of military valor. At 0534 hours, with Forward Operating Base Chapman visible in the distance, Captain Vasquez's team encountered the third and most heavily defended enemy position. Automatic weapons fire from entrenched positions made advancement impossible, and enemy forces had positioned themselves to prevent any approach to the base. The third position, the one that almost ended everything, the one that turned a difficult mission into what should have been an impossible mission. I remember looking at that final stretch of ground, calculating angles of fire and probability of survival, understanding that there was no tactical solution that didn't involve someone dying. I remember the radio call I couldn't make because our communications were destroyed, the air support I couldn't request because aircraft were grounded, the backup plan that didn't exist because we were already the backup planned. Derek's colleagues have moved even further away from him, creating an isolation zone that makes his humiliation even more visible. In the social ecosystem of Chicago's elite, proximity to disaster is contagious, and Derek Morrison has just revealed himself to be someone whose judgment is so fundamentally flawed that association becomes professionally hazardous. Realizing that conventional tactics would not succeed and that time was running out before the planned enemy attack on the sleeping soldiers, Captain Vasquez made a decision that violated every safety protocol and tactical doctrine she had been taught. Violated every safety protocol and tactical doctrine. The phrase that captures exactly what Derek could never understand about real leadership and real courage. Following protocol would have meant retreating, regrouping, and accepting that 127 soldiers would die while we developed a safer plan. Breaking protocol meant accepting personal responsibility for an outcome that couldn't be guaranteed, taking risks that couldn't be calculated, making decisions that would either save lives or cost them. Derek, who spent 20 minutes explaining that military service attracts people who need rigid structure and can't handle complexity, is learning that military service sometimes requires throwing out structure entirely and improvising solutions to problems that have never been solved before. Captain Vasquez instructed her remaining team members to provide covering fire while she advanced alone across 400 meters of open ground under sustained enemy fire, carrying the radio beacon that would allow the sleeping soldiers at Forward Operating Base Chapman to receive the warning that would save their lives. Alone across 400 meters of open ground, the detail that makes even experienced military personnel pause and recalculate what they thought they knew about courage and dedication. 4 football fields of distance with no cover, no concealment, and people shooting at you the entire way, not running toward safety, but running toward danger because other people's lives depended on it. I can feel the memory trying to surface. The weight of the radio beacon, the sound of bullets impacting the ground around me, the certainty that I was going to die, but the more important certainty that 127 people were going to live if I could just keep running for another 30 seconds, another minute, another lifetime measured in heartbeats and muzzle flashes. Derek is completely silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by the kind of profound stillness that comes from watching your entire understanding of reality collapse in real time. The man who confidently explained that I chose military service because I couldn't handle real-world competition is beginning to understand that real-world competition sometimes involves running across open ground while people try to kill you. The event coordinator pauses in her reading, letting the weight of what she's just described settle over the ballroom. 800 people processing the image of a 25-year-old woman making the conscious decision to cross 400 meters of hostile ground alone, knowing that the odds of survival were minimal, but the cost of failure was unacceptable. Captain Vasquez reached Forward Operating Base Chapman at 0547 hours, delivered the warning that allowed 127 soldiers to prepare defensive positions, and then turned around to make the return journey to assist her wounded team members who were still pinned down by enemy fire. Turned around to make the return journey. The detail that separates heroes from people who perform single acts of courage under pressure. After completing a mission that should have been impossible, after delivering the warning that saved 127 lives, I made the decision to go back. Not because protocol required it, not because orders demanded it, but because Thompson and Rodriguez were still bleeding in hostile territory, and leaving them behind wasn't an option. Derek's face has completed its transformation from confident to humiliated to something approaching grief. He's not just wrong about me. He's revealed himself to be wrong about fundamental questions of character and courage. He's demonstrated that his confident pronouncements about human nature are based on such limited understanding that they call into question his basic competence as a judge of anything important. The silence in the ballroom is profound, broken only by the event coordinator's voice and the barely audible sound of Derek's worldview crumbling into dust. These are people accustomed to recognizing significance, and they understand they're witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the citation of someone who performed impossible actions, but the complete destruction of someone who publicly revealed himself to be incapable of recognizing greatness when it was standing right in front of him. The return journey required Captain Vasquez to again cross the same 400 meters of open ground, this time carrying additional ammunition and medical supplies for her wounded team members. Despite being wounded, exhausted, and operating without any form of support, Captain Vasquez completed the return journey and provided the covering fire that allowed her team to begin their evacuation. The return journey, twice across the same killing field, twice running toward gunfire, twice making the conscious decision that other people's lives were more important than her own survival. The kind of decision that Derek, who spent 20 minutes analyzing my psychological need for external validation, apparently believes is motivated by an inability to compete in the real world. I can see Derek's mind working, trying to find some way to reconcile what he's hearing with the confident analysis he'd just shared with everyone in earshot. The cognitive dissonance is visible, painful, the process of someone discovering that their understanding of reality was so fundamentally flawed that it calls into question everything else they think they know. But there's more. The citation isn't finished, and Derek's humiliation is just beginning. Because the event coordinator is about to describe the part of the mission that transformed impossible actions into legendary actions. The part that made military historians rewrite their understanding of what individuals can accomplish under the worst possible circumstances. The part that will make Derek Morrison's confident pronouncements about my character and capabilities echo in this ballroom like accusations of his own profound inadequacy. And as the coordinator prepares to continue reading, I can see Derek beginning to understand that his social and professional reputation isn't just damaged. It's about to be completely destroyed by the voice of a woman reading historical facts about someone he thought he understood, but never actually knew at all. The number lands in the ballroom like thunder, and I can see even the most senior military officials present. Generals who've commanded divisions and planned operations involving thousands of troops pause to process the implications. Derek, who spent the evening explaining that military service involves following orders and hoping for the best, is learning that military service sometimes involves being outnumbered 67-1 and still finding a way to complete the mission. The woman in emerald silk has abandoned all pretense of looking at anything other than Derek, her expression a mixture of fascination and horror as she watches someone commit social suicide in front of 800 witnesses. She's observing a level of wrongness so profound that it transcends simple mistake and enters the realm of character revelation, the kind of spectacular failure of judgment that people remember and discuss for years. Realizing that her warning had only addressed 1/3 of the planned attack, and that hundreds of additional American soldiers remained in mortal danger, Captain Vasquez made a decision that military historians now describe as unprecedented in modern warfare. Unprecedented in modern warfare. The phrase hangs in the air like an indictment of everything Derek thought he knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it means to serve something larger than yourself. Military historians, people who study warfare as their profession, who analyze thousands of combat actions and evaluate them for significance and impact, have determined that my actions were unlike anything they'd previously documented. Derek's investment banking colleagues have now created a zone of complete isolation around him, their body language, making it clear that proximity to his spectacular failure of judgment has become professionally hazardous. These are men who've built their careers on reading situations and positioning themselves advantageously, and they can see with crystalline clarity that Derek Morrison has just revealed himself to be someone whose confident pronouncements about reality are based on such fundamentally flawed understanding that association becomes dangerous. Despite being wounded, exhausted, and operating without communication or support, Captain Vasquez volunteered to attempt to warn the other two American positions, knowing that doing so would require crossing 23 miles of hostile territory controlled entirely by enemy forces. 23 miles of hostile territory. The distance that separates impossible from legendary. That transforms extraordinary action into something that military academies will study for decades. Derek, who confidently explained that I needed external validation and couldn't compete in the real world, is learning that real-world competition sometimes involves volunteering to cross 23 miles of enemy-controlled territory, because other people's lives depend on your willingness to risk everything. I can feel the memories threatening to surface, the weight of the additional ammunition I carried, the taste of dust and blood, the certainty that I was going to die somewhere in those 23 miles, but the more important certainty that if I didn't try, hundreds of soldiers would die in their sleep. I remember the calculation that wasn't really a calculation, the decision that wasn't really a choice, the moment when mathematics became irrelevant, because the only question that mattered was whether I could live with myself, if I didn't attempt the impossible. The general I'd noticed earlier is now staring at Derek with an expression of such profound disgust that it's visible from across the ballroom. This is a man who spent 4 decades in military service, who's commanded troops in multiple conflicts, who understands exactly what 23 miles of hostile territory means in practical terms. He's watching a civilian who's never faced anything more dangerous than market volatility publicly dismiss actions that represent the absolute pinnacle of military courage. Operating alone and carrying only the ammunition and supplies she could carry on foot, Captain Vasquez began what became a 4-day journey through territory where American forces had never operated successfully, where every mile was defended by enemy combatants who had been preparing for months to repel exactly this kind of incursion. 4 days. The time frame that transformed a rescue mission into an endurance test of human will and determination. Derek, who spent 20 minutes explaining that military service attracts people who can't handle complexity and ambiguity, is learning that some military operations involve navigating complexity so intense that survival becomes a moment-by-moment achievement, requiring constant adaptation to circumstances that change without warning. Derek is completely motionless now, his earlier animation replaced by the kind of profound stillness that comes from watching everything you thought you knew about reality prove to be wrong. The confident investment banker who treated my military service like an elaborate hobby has been confronted with evidence that my military service involved actions that most people couldn't imagine, much less accomplish. During the first day of her solo journey, Captain Vasquez encountered and successfully evaded or neutralized 17 separate enemy positions, using tactics and strategies that had never been attempted by American forces operating in that region. 17 separate enemy positions. Each one a potential end to the mission, each one requiring split-second decisions about engagement or evasion, each one offering the opportunity to turn back and accept that the impossible was actually impossible. Derek, who confidently analyzed my psychological need for external validation, is learning that external validation is irrelevant when you're alone in hostile territory making decisions that will determine whether hundreds of people live or die. The silence in the ballroom has become profound, the kind of absolute quiet that occurs when people are processing information that challenges their fundamental understanding of what human beings are capable of accomplishing. These are individuals accustomed to significant achievements, political, financial, social, but they're learning that significance exists on scales they'd never considered. On the second day, Captain Vasquez's route took her through a valley where enemy forces had established a command center for coordinating the planned attacks on American positions. Rather than circumvent this heavily defended position, Captain Vasquez made the decision to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Rather than circumvent, the phrase that captures everything Derek couldn't understand about real leadership and actual courage. The safe choice, the reasonable choice, the choice that any rational person would make, was to avoid the command center and continue toward the objective. The choice I made was to gather intelligence that might save additional lives, even though doing so multiplied the risks and reduced my chances of survival to near zero. Derek's face has progressed through confusion, comprehension, and horror to reach something approaching grief. He's not just wrong about me. He's revealed himself to be wrong about fundamental questions of character, courage, and what it means to serve something larger than yourself. He's demonstrated that his confident analysis of human nature is based on such limited understanding that it calls into question his basic competence as a judge of anything important. The intelligence Captain Vasquez gathered at the enemy command center revealed that the coordinated attack was even larger than originally estimated, involving not just American positions, but also Allied forces from 3 different countries, with total potential casualties exceeding 800 military personnel. Over 800 potential casualties. The number that transforms a rescue mission into something approaching the prevention of a military disaster that would have reshaped American involvement in Afghanistan. Derek, who spent the evening explaining that military achievements are just elaborate make-believe, is learning that some military achievements prevent catastrophes that would have international implications and historical significance. One of Derek's colleagues, the senior partner whose expression has progressed from embarrassment to revulsion, takes a deliberate step further away from Derek and begins scanning the room for other conversation partners. He's witnessing a social catastrophe so complete that continued association would represent a failure of professional judgment, and he's making the calculated decision to distance himself from someone whose wrongness has become so spectacular that it constitutes a reputational hazard. Using the intelligence she had gathered, Captain Vasquez was able to identify weaknesses in enemy defensive positions and plan routes to the remaining American bases that avoided the heaviest concentrations of enemy forces. Plan routes. The detail that highlights the gap between Derek's understanding of military service as following orders and the reality of military service as solving problems that have never been solved before. Using information that's incomplete and constantly changing, under pressure that would break most people. Planning routes through hostile territory isn't following orders. It's creating solutions to problems that exist only in your imagination until you make them real. Derek is no longer looking at me or at the event coordinator. He's staring at some point in the middle distance, his expression suggesting someone who's trying to process information that's too large for his conceptual framework. The confident worldview that allowed him to analyze my character and motivations has proven inadequate to contain the reality of what I actually accomplished. On the third day of her journey, Captain Vasquez reached the second American position and successfully delivered warnings that allowed 184 soldiers to prepare defensive positions and coordinate with headquarters for air support that had become available as weather conditions improved. 184 soldiers. Another 184 lives saved by someone Derek described as playing dress-up in a military costume. The mathematics of heroism aren't complicated. 184 people who went to sleep that night and woke up the next morning because someone was willing to cross hostile territory alone to warn them of danger they couldn't see coming. The event coordinator pauses again, consulting her notes for the climactic portion of the citation. The ballroom remains absolutely silent. 800 people hanging on every word of a story that's systematically destroying one man's credibility, while revealing the extraordinary character of someone he thought he understood, but never actually knew. But Captain Vasquez's mission was not yet complete. The third American position was located an additional 8 miles through the most heavily defended terrain in the region, in an area where no American forces had operated successfully, and where enemy commanders had concentrated their most experienced fighters. The most heavily defended terrain in the region, the detail that transforms an already impossible mission into something that military tacticians would reject as suicide if it appeared in a planning document. Derek, who confidently explained that I chose military service because I needed to feel special, is learning that feeling special is irrelevant when you're facing the kind of challenges that most people would consider unsurvivable. Knowing that attempting to reach the third position would require crossing terrain where survival was unlikely, and knowing that failure to warn the remaining 331 soldiers would result in casualties that could affect the strategic balance of American operations in the region, Captain Vasquez made the decision to continue her mission. 331 soldiers. The final number in the mathematics of heroism, the lives that hung in the balance while I made calculations about probability and mortality in terrain where both were working against me. Derek, who spent 20 minutes explaining that military service is just elaborate role-playing, is learning that some roles involve making decisions about other people's lives while your own life hangs by threads you can't control. I can see Derek's investment banking colleagues actively avoiding eye contact with him now, their body language making it clear that proximity to his spectacular failure of judgment has become not just professionally hazardous but socially toxic. These are people who understand that reputation is everything in their world, and they're watching someone reveal himself to be so fundamentally wrong about something so important that association becomes impossible. The approach to the third American position required Captain Vasquez to traverse terrain that enemy forces had spent months preparing to defend, using tactics and equipment specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration she was attempting. Terrain that enemy forces had spent months preparing to defend. The kind of defensive preparation that usually requires overwhelming force or extensive air support to overcome, attempted by someone operating alone with limited ammunition, and no possibility of backup or evacuation. Derek, who confidently analyzed my psychological need for external validation, is learning that external validation becomes irrelevant when you're alone in terrain specifically designed to kill people like you. The general I'd noticed earlier has moved closer to our area of the ballroom, apparently drawn by a combination of professional respect and personal disgust at Derek's earlier commentary. He's positioning himself to have a clear view of Derek's reaction to information that every military professional in the room understands, represents achievements beyond anything they've personally witnessed or accomplished. Despite enemy resistance that included coordinated fire from multiple positions, improvised explosive devices placed along likely approach routes, and defensive preparations that had been months in development, Captain Vasquez successfully reached the 3rd American position and delivered the warnings that allowed 331 soldiers to prepare coordinated defenses. Successfully reached the 3rd American position. 4 words that summarize actions requiring skills, courage, and determination that most people couldn't imagine, much less execute. Derek, who spent the evening explaining that I couldn't handle real-world competition, is learning that real-world competitions sometimes involve succeeding at missions that military planners would consider impossible, even under optimal conditions. The woman in emerald silk is no longer even pretending to look at anything other than Derek, her fascination with his social catastrophe having overcome any concern about social propriety. She's witnessing the complete destruction of someone's credibility and reputation in real time, watching confidence transform into humiliation so complete that it will follow him for the rest of his professional life. The coordinated defensive actions made possible by Captain Vasquez's warnings resulted in the complete failure of the enemy attack, the capture of 67 enemy combatants, and the prevention of what military analysts determined would have been the deadliest attack on American forces since the beginning of operations in Afghanistan. The complete failure of the enemy attack. The ultimate validation of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The proof that risking everything was worth it because everyone lived. Derek, who confidently explained that military achievements are just psychological compensation for feeling ordinary, is learning that some achievements prevent disasters that would have reshaped military history. Derek's mouth is moving again, forming words that don't become sounds, like someone trying to argue with mathematics or negotiate with physics. The confident investment banker who analyzed my character and motivations with such certainty has been confronted with evidence that his analysis was not just wrong, but spectacularly, catastrophically wrong, in ways that reveal fundamental flaws in his understanding of human nature and achievement. Captain Vasquez's 4-day solo mission through hostile territory resulted in warnings that saved 642 American and Allied lives, intelligence that led to the disruption of enemy operations across 3 provinces, and tactical innovations that have been incorporated into special operations doctrine and are currently being taught at military academies around the world. 642 lives. The final accounting of heroism, the number that transforms individual achievement into historical significance. Derek, who spent 20 minutes explaining that I was wasting my potential in military service, is learning that my potential exceeded anything his limited imagination could comprehend, and that my achievements will be studied and emulated long after his investment banking career is forgotten. The silence in the ballroom has become overwhelming. 800 people processing the reality that they've just heard an account of achievements that most of them couldn't have imagined were possible. These are individuals accustomed to significant accomplishments, but they're learning that significance exists on scales that redefine what human beings can accomplish when other people's lives depend on their willingness to risk everything. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator says, her voice building toward the crescendo that everyone in the ballroom can sense is coming, please join me in giving Captain Elena Vasquez the recognition she deserves for service above and beyond anything this nation has ever asked of its soldiers. And then it happens. General Chen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is the first to rise. His movement is deliberate, ceremonial, the kind of gesture that carries decades of military tradition and respect. He stands at full attention, his posture perfect despite his age, his expression one of profound respect for achievements that even he, someone who's commanded hundreds of thousands of troops and advised presidents, recognizes as extraordinary. General Santos follows immediately, her movement equally deliberate and respectful. Then Colonel Williams, then Major Reynolds, then every military professional in the ballroom rising in unison, like a wave of respect and recognition, that spreads outward from the center of the room. But they're not alone. Senator Patricia Williams rises next, her movements slower but equally deliberate, followed by the mayor, the governor's representative, and every political figure in the ballroom. These are people who understand power and achievement, who measure significance in votes and legislation and policy impact, and they recognize that they're in the presence of someone whose achievements dwarf their own. The business leaders follow, CEOs whose companies employ thousands, entrepreneurs whose innovations have changed industries, philanthropists whose donations fund hospitals and universities. They rise because they understand that they're witnessing something unprecedented, someone whose accomplishments make their own significant achievements look ordinary by comparison. And then, like a tide that can't be stopped, the entire ballroom rises. 800 of Chicago's most influential citizens, standing in recognition of achievements they couldn't have imagined, paying respect to someone whose courage and dedication exceed anything any of them have ever witnessed or accomplished. The standing ovation builds slowly, starting with respectful applause and growing into something approaching thunder. These aren't people who applaud easily or give standing ovations lightly, but they recognize that they're in the presence of greatness, that they're witnessing recognition of achievements that will be remembered long after they're all forgotten. And through it all, Derek Morrison remains seated, not by choice, but because his legs won't support him. Not because he's making a statement, but because he's psychologically incapable of processing what's happening around him. He sits in his chair like a man who's just watched his entire understanding of reality collapse, surrounded by 800 people standing in honor of someone he spent 20 minutes publicly dismissing as a fake soldier playing dress-up. The applause continues for what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, the sound echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers like thunder. I can see Derek in my peripheral vision, the only person in the ballroom still seated, his face a study in the kind of profound humiliation that follows people for the rest of their lives. When the applause finally begins to subside and people start to return to their seats, I notice that several groups don't sit down immediately. Military personnel remain standing, continuing their recognition of achievements they understand better than anyone else in the room. Political figures remain standing, understanding that they're witnessing historical significance. Business leaders remain standing, recognizing accomplishments that exceed anything they've achieved in their own fields. And Derek's investment banking colleagues remain standing, their continued applause serving as a deliberate contrast to Derek's inability to move, their respect for my achievements highlighted by their obvious distancing from someone whose judgment has proven so spectacularly wrong. As the formal applause finally ends and conversations begin to resume, I can see Derek's social isolation becoming complete. The colleagues who surrounded him earlier have moved to other parts of the ballroom, the networking connections he was building have evaporated, and the professional relationships he was cultivating have been poisoned by his spectacular display of wrongness about something so fundamental. The event coordinator approaches the microphone one final time, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who's just facilitated a moment of genuine significance. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Elena Vasquez has graciously agreed to remain for a few minutes to meet with anyone who would like to express their gratitude personally. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking her for her extraordinary service to our nation. And with those words, the evening transitions from formal program to personal interaction, from public recognition to individual conversations. I can see people beginning to move in my direction, generals who want to discuss tactical innovations, politicians who want to understand policy implications, business leaders who want to express their respect for achievements they're still trying to comprehend. But Derek remains seated, isolated in his chair like someone who's been abandoned by reality itself. The confident investment banker who spent the evening analyzing my character and explaining my limitations has been reduced to a man who can't stand up, because standing would require acknowledging that everything he believed about me was wrong. The irony is complete, perfect, satisfying in ways that fiction couldn't improve. The man who publicly dismissed me as a fake soldier playing dress-up has just watched 800 people stand in recognition of achievements that exceed anything he's ever accomplished or could accomplish. The man who explained that I couldn't handle real-world competition has just learned that my version of competition involves succeeding at missions that redefine what human beings can accomplish under impossible circumstances. As people begin to approach me, shaking hands and expressing gratitude for service they're still trying to process, I catch one final glimpse of Derek. He's still seated, staring at nothing, his expression that of someone who's just discovered that his confident understanding of reality was built on foundations so flawed that the entire structure has collapsed. And for the first time since walking into this ballroom, I smile. Not because Derek's humiliation brings me joy, but because his reaction proves something I've always believed: that real achievement speaks for itself, that genuine service doesn't require external validation, and that the people who matter will recognize worth when they see it, regardless of what the people who don't matter choose to believe. Derek Morrison thought he knew who Elena Vasquez was. Tonight, 800 people learned who Elena Vasquez actually is. And the difference between those two versions of reality will follow Derek for the rest of his professional life. A permanent reminder that confidence without understanding is just elaborate ignorance disguised as expertise. The Medal of Honor on my chest isn't just recognition of actions taken in Afghanistan. It's proof that worth doesn't depend on other people's ability to recognize it, that achievement doesn't require approval from people who lack the vision to see it, and that the most devastating response to public dismissal is simply being yourself and letting reality speak for itself. Derek Morrison tried to shame me in public. Instead, he revealed himself to be someone whose judgment is so fundamentally flawed that he publicly dismissed achievements that 800 of the most influential people in Chicago recognized as extraordinary. And sometimes, justice is just that simple.